creating affordable housing. And at BayCoast Bank, we really pride ourselves on championing affordable housing, whether we're financing a new multi-unit development for a nonprofit, or whether we're arranging a mortgage and homeowners insurance for first-time home buyers through BayCoast Mortgage and BayCoast Insurance. We're always trying to help people get into affordable homes. Our mission at BayCoast is to provide exceptional service and solutions to the community. And when it comes to community development and affordable housing, BayCoast Bank really walks the walk. In 2024, the bank donated $2 million to worthy causes and charitable endeavors throughout the South Coast and Rhode Island. In addition, the bank set up a down payment assistance fund, and we funded that in the last several years with $1.5 million. So in that, working with BayCoast Mortgage, we've been able to give eligible first-time home buyers a down payment assistance grant to help them buy a home, because as you know, homes are so expensive and it's so difficult for people to get into homes. But even in doing all that, it's not enough. The combination of rising home prices, very short inventory. If anybody's looked to buy a home, you realize how few homes have been on the market in recent years, and the increased interest rates has made it very unaffordable to buy a home. As a matter of fact, right now in Massachusetts, the affordability index is at an all-time low, so it's harder to buy a home now than it ever has been. And if anyone's a renter or you have family members that are rents have increased nearly 50% in the last 6 or 7 years, and they've clearly outpaced wage growth. So the rent has become much more unaffordable for people, making it very difficult for them to save a down payment. In addition, we've had a lot of extreme weather events have caused insurance premiums to rise, energy costs have risen, property maintenance costs. So that's really put a squeeze on homeowners, whether they're young or older. It's been very difficult for people to do that. So because of all that, the real estate industry has really welcomed a new law that was passed in Massachusetts in February, and it was part of the Affordable Housing Act legislation. And it's an exciting tool to address the dilemma. And to that end, we've assembled a panel of area experts to share their knowledge with you this evening. I'm going to introduce the entire panel first, and then we'll go into our presentation. We do ask that you hold your questions for the end, and we'll do a question and answer session so that everybody will be able to answer their questions of the panel. So, seated from your left to right, we have John Aubin, who's the Seekonk town planner, and next to John is Amy Messier, who's the Somerset town planner, and Tim Turner, who's the Somerset conservation agent. And then batting cleanup, we have Chris Perrano. He's also the town planner from Swansea. So we've got a great panel of town municipal officials, so we thank very much the towns for their participation in tonight's event. And then next we have Gary Mello, who's president of Oracle Homes, a local home builder, who will discuss the construction of ADU units. And after that, we have a couple of people from BayCoast. We have Rico Conforti, a vice president, senior loan officer from BayCoast Mortgage. He's going to discuss how to finance an ADU. Rico's the GOAT mortgages. If any of you look at Instagram, you've seen his recent post with a goat. It's gone viral. How many views do you have, Rico?
7,000.
7,000, wow. And last but not least, from BayCoast Insurance, Connie Wida, who will present on the intricacies of properly insuring the ADU that you have constructed on your property. So, just to go quickly to the next slide, Kyle. What is an accessory dwelling unit? It's typically a smaller additional living space that's separate from the main residence. Some people call them in-laws or guest apartments. An ADU may be added to or created within or detached from your primary dwelling. There's a lot of ways to go about it, a lot of possibilities. A couple of the ones that come to mind first, by creating these, what's great is that you're able to create units in dwellings that already exist. You may not have to build it. It may be part of your house, maybe a garage, etc. And it's also on land that's already developed. So some people build a separate ADU in the backyard, and others may either add on to their house or create it within the footprint. Older relatives wanting to downsize is an excellent opportunity for an ADU. children who cannot yet afford to move out. A lot of people may have kids who went off to college and came back, and then they just stay, right? They never go. And it also can create rental income for the owners. So there's lots of things that can be positive outcomes of an ADU, and then I will let our expert panel speak to these. So we're going to start with John, who's going to speak to the law that was passed and also the town of Seekonk.
Good evening, everyone. I think Dan did a great job of laying out the framework of kind of why the state went forward and changed the laws to allow for accessory dwelling units by right. Before I get into kind of filling in some of the gaps and filling in the specifics on that, just want to introduce myself. My name is John Orban. I'm the town planner for the town of Seekonk. I've been working for the town of Seekonk for the past 10 years, since 2015. Before that, I was the planning director in the town of Cumberland in Rhode Island. Prior to that, I was one of the staff planners for the town of North Kingstown. Prior to that, I was in private practice in the state of Rhode Island as a member of the Rhode Island Bar. Back in 2024, the state adopted an amendment to Massachusetts General Law, section chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Enabling Act. What they did was actually adopt a definition for accessory dwelling units. Prior to that, there had not been a state definition of accessory dwelling units, so that really left the communities kind of on their own to develop and kind of address accessory dwelling units each individually, which kind of happens a lot in Massachusetts. Where the state hasn't made a specific regulation or a specific law, the towns kind of fill in the gaps and adopt their own. Very similar to what happens with site plan review, which is really just an animal that lives just within the municipalities. There isn't any statewide site plan law that applies across all of Massachusetts. So in adopting the accessory dwelling unit definition, I'm just going to read it for you here very quickly, not to bore you too much. But ultimately, this is two of the pieces within Massachusetts general law that really kind of set the legal framework at the state level for how these accessory dwelling units can exist. An accessory dwelling unit, as defined by the state, is a self-contained housing unit inclusive of sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities on the same lot as a principal dwelling, subject to otherwise applicable dimensional and parking requirements that, one, maintains separate entrance, either directly from the outside or through an entry hall or corridor shared with the principal dwelling, sufficient to meet the requirements of the state building code for safe egress. Two, is not larger than in gross floor area than half the gross floor area of the principal dwelling unit, or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. And three, is subject to additional restrictions as may be imposed by a municipality, including but not limited to additional size restrictions and restrictions or prohibitions on short-term rentals as defined in section 1 of chapter 64G, provided, however, that no municipality shall unreasonably restrict the creation of rental or accessory dwelling units that is not a short-term rent. A second definition that's important to kind of keep in mind is they also adopted a definition of as of right, and that means a development that may proceed under a zoning ordinance or bylaw without the need for a special permit, variance, zoning amendment, waiver, or other discretionary zoning approval. Prior to the adoption of the 2004 amendments, generally what happened specifically in Seekonk, you would need to get a special permit from the zoning board to add that second official unit to your property. In Seekonk, it actually required you to have twice the required amount of area to put that second unit on, and it was still restricted as far as size. The other amendment that was pertinent to this, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, provides a number of what are called carve-outs within the Zoning Enabling Act, which are areas that municipalities cannot impose zoning restrictions. And this amendment specifically stated that accessory dwelling units were allowed by right. So that meant that any city or town could not put a special permit requirement on, no longer could put a special permit requirement on accessory dwelling units. So with regard to that definition that I originally just went through, some of the things that are important to note are the three requirements that they had with regard to the housing unit. First, that it's a self-contained unit. This isn't just renting an extra bedroom that you might have. This is actually a self-contained unit, and what that means, it means it has facilities for sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a living room, but it certainly has to have a bedroom, has to have a kitchen, and has to have a bathroom with adequate facilities to qualify as a dwelling unit under the building code. Again, it also mentioned that there has to be a separate entrance. Again, this isn't just kind of sectioning off a portion of the house and saying that's yours. It's really has to have a separate, distinct entrance that's lockable to create that actual dwelling unit. And again, it has to meet the requirements of the building code. With regard to the size, you might have heard me mention 900 square feet or 50% of the principal unit. The reason why it's 50% of the principal unit, if you were at 51% of the principal unit, your accessory unit would become your principal unit. So accessory and principal at times becomes down to that 50 versus 51%, or 51 versus 49%. So it can't be any larger than 900 square feet. Some other considerations that should be put into place when one's considering adopting an accessory dwelling unit, and this is kind of almost a speech that I give to a lot of developers that come in when they're looking to develop a site. Having worked in Rhode Island, planning in Rhode Island is almost like a funnel. Everything comes through and goes through the planner, and then you have a lot of the reviews are done at the state level, particularly with regard to septics, with regard to wetlands. In Massachusetts, it's totally different. I often describe it as wrestling with an octopus, because you have the planning board, you have the zoning board, you have the board of health, you have the conservation commission, you have all these separate individual local bodies that are responsible for a different, I like to say, arm of the octopus. So if there are wetlands on the property, you need to deal with the conservation commission if you're doing new construction. One of the most important ones, however, is a septic. Obviously, if you're adding an additional bedroom to your property, you need to document to the Board of Health that you have capacity within your septic system to take that additional load. Sometimes there are ways to get around that. If you have a 3-bedroom septic system and you can get rid of a bedroom, there's some kind of ways to get around that. That's something you need to work with your building official to identify. But one of the major considerations is making sure that your existing facilities, be it the septic system, be it the water, be it even the electrical service, are able to handle that additional load that you're going to be putting onto your property overall. In addition to that, I mentioned wetlands. Other local bylaws that might come into play in regulations. In the definition, they mentioned short-term rentals. I know everybody's kind of familiar with the Airbnb kind of situation. A lot of towns are now reacting to that, adopting short-term rental regulations. Seekonk has not done so at this point, but I can certainly see it becoming an issue down the line, and some of the other communities might have a different experience and more specific on that. And then other than that, the other thing I wanted to mention to take into consideration is the building code. I know a lot of people kind of these days kind of hear and see the kind of tiny house idea, and people can even go onto Amazon and buy pop-up structures. The important thing to note is, particularly before you start putting money into something like that, you want to make sure that whatever you're purchasing, be it quote-unquote tiny house, be it pre-constructed unit, you want to make sure that it's going to meet the building code and it's going to be acceptable to your building commissioner and your building official. Because what you don't want to do is have this thing pull up on a flatbed onto your property, have the building official come out and take a look at it and start laughing and say, you better send that back because there's no way it can be used here in Massachusetts. So that's a pretty significant consideration. Other than that, I do want to talk a little bit about what Seekonk had done. I had mentioned previously that Seekonk had required a special permit, and the only way you could really get that was to have double the amount of area. That's not really an accessory dwelling unit. That's really what I would call a duplex if anybody asked me to analyze it. So what we did is we adopted in 2024, and it was really part of a number of other zoning compliance amendments that we put forward that year at our fall town meeting, with regard to some other changes that the state had made with regard to the majority required at town meeting for certain zoning amendments, with regard to the accessory dwelling units, as well as a few other kind of zoning tweaks that we had made. With regard to the accessory dwelling units, as being part of that kind of package, it wasn't really subject to too much discussion or argument at town meeting. It was really kind of a recognition on the town's part. This is what the state of the law is. We're kind of accepting it. I'm sure there's some grumbling that kind of went on, as always does at town meeting. But we were able to adopt it, and we've had it in place now for just about a year. It'll be a year coming up at this following town meeting. We have seen some folks come in, even just before we got the zoning amendment in. We were already seeing people as soon as the zoning amendment was, the state zoning amendment was announced. We already were seeing people come in with interest in it. And generally, anybody comes into our office, our first is to direct them to the building official to kind of get the punch list of what the considerations are and what the concerns are. One thing I did not mention was zoning and setbacks. One thing you do and that really only applies if you're building or adding construction of either an outbuilding or adding onto your existing principal structure. You always want to make sure of setbacks, because you could end up getting to the zoning board via that, which isn't necessarily to say that the zoning board's going to deny your application, but I could see it being a factor because it's always the question of why do you want this addition and justifying it. But Now, instead of saying, saying I just want to have an additional unit, you can say I want an additional unit because that's what's permitted by state law.
So I'm going to go over the opportunities that ADUs present for everyone in town. And I'm speaking specifically, in general, the opportunities the ADUs present to everyone, but specifically I'm speaking about Somerset because that's where I have experience. So ADUs for the opportunities. They provide multi-generational living, which is ideal for aging parents while keeping families together and independent. They also produce workforce housing, which can be affordable rentals for teachers or first responders without the town building a new housing unit. There's increased housing stock, which builds gentle density, helps relieve housing shortages without drastically altering neighborhoods, and offers controlled growth with minimal impact. And then lastly, flexible housing supply. The ADUs offer niche development with a smaller investment, quicker delivery, and new homes. The benefits for both homeowners and the town for ADUs are as follows. For homeowners, this can be extra income stream. The rental property can help offset mortgage, taxes, or help save for retirement. It could increase property value. Homes with ADUs often command higher resale price value due to the potential rental or expanded living space. For the town, the pros for accessory dwelling units are it boosts tax revenue. The units increase property taxes without new public service burden. They support local workforce, which low impact way to retain essential workers who might not otherwise afford housing in town. And they're efficient for land use. They utilize existing infrastructure while preserving open space. The local process in Somerset, what people do is usually, if you can meet the requirements that the law says in 2024, so you have your location, your setbacks, your size, your egress, and utilities. If you can meet all of those within the zoning that the state has presented, then you can go straight to the building department by right and apply for building permit to do your in-law, your accessory dwelling unit. In-law, what they used to call them. But if, let's say, you have a lot, which is very common in Somerset, they're undersized lots because we called them postage stamp lots back in the day. They were a lot smaller than they are today. And let's say you have a 20,000 square foot lot. You have a large home on that lot. And you're aging and you want maybe your family to move in there. Maybe your daughter, your son, their spouse, and grandkids. You can still do that if you don't have the proper setbacks, and just like John had mentioned, you would just have to go to the zoning board for a variance, which you would just have to basically prove your case that financially and topographically, if you want to put an in-law or an accessory dwelling unit, on the property without the proper setbacks, you just need a variance, and as long as you can satisfy the criteria for one of those, then the zoning board is pretty lenient and understanding, and they're very much on board with helping families that are already living in town, especially within Somerset. What I have seen from a few of the accessory dwelling units that have come through the zoning board are common concerns by neighbors, and one of them is parking and congestion and worries about extra cars and street parking. However, now that new law in 2024, it basically disallows new parking minimums for accessory dwelling units near transit, and local justification is required elsewhere. For the change in neighborhood character, a lot of people feel that your neighborhood might be desensitized, or it might start looking like a multifamily conversion of a neighborhood. And unfortunately, that is also a null point in the new laws for 2024 that the state has sent out. When it comes to student rentals, residents worry about transient and non-family occupants, but zoning cannot restrict who occupies the accessory dwelling unit. However, towns can prohibit short-term rentals less than 31 days. I think that is for the basic background of ADUs and how they're beneficial for the town and for the homeowners. And Tim, I think you can speak to some implications if you have wetlands or.
These ADUs. Any structure that goes up, if you're in a particular area, you may be required to file a request for determination or a notice of intent, which would be advertised. Notice of intent hearing, the abutters are notified to speak to it, and it is treated like any other structure. There's no exemptions. There's not a lot for me to say about it. It's like if you were building anything else, you would have to come before the board if you fell into that particular area. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Perino. I'm the town planner in Swansea. Here, thank you for coming to Swansea. Thank you for BayCoast for putting this together. Anyone here from Swansea? All right, good. Hometown showing through. What's great about batting cleanup tonight is most of my colleagues from the other towns have covered the basics here. The state law really standardizes the practice for ADUs across the board in all municipalities. So what you're learning here is going to carry through most of the surrounding towns. In Swansea, we kept the definition as prescribed by the state and have tried to make the process really simple. We have an online permitting portal, so when you're ready to build your ADU, you just submit your building plans and your site plans through our online portal. It goes to all the necessary permitting departments, and they'll review and issue any comments if there are any. And if you've kind of hit all the marks the first try, you'll be approved for your building permit. These are very exciting units for our towns because they do allow flexibility as property owners. You can earn some rental income and take care of your family in different ways than what was permitted before. That's all I have for you. I won't hold you back from the people I think you want to hear from as far as building and financing these. So Gary Mello's up next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary Mello. I'm the owner of Oracle Homes. We're based in Seekonk. We're a home building company. We build in Rhode Island and South Coast, Mass. And we do have some experience. We've built about 5, 8, we're calling them today ADUs. I call them accessory dwellings because that was the previous name that some of the towns in Mass have been allowing them in recent years. And now we have sort of the state mandate that's giving us regulations across the state, which is a good thing. What we typically do is we do new construction, we do renovations, we do additions, and we also do the ADUs. When we meet with a new client about an ADU, what we typically do is immediately sit down and discuss what the living arrangement is going to be, because that's a big factor in terms of the design and the cost of an ADU. So we meet with some families where they decide, we're going to have a separate kitchen, separate bathroom, but we may share a laundry space or some other space with the existing house. In some cases, we do a build out in the basement. In some cases, we do an addition to an existing house where it's a new structure that gets attached to the house. And what's really new with the new regulation is the fact that we can utilize detached structures, which is going to be really helpful for a lot of families. So if you have a detached barn that's existing or a detached garage, we could utilize that structure to convert that into an ADU, which could potentially save a lot of money instead of building a completely new structure. So what we usually do is start with that, is what are the requirements, what's the living arrangements gonna be, and then now with the new regulation too, the fact that we'd be able to create a separate unit and rent it out to someone who's not related to you, who's not family, that's certainly gonna open a lot of doors. And I think once word gets around with this, I think this is just beginning. There's gonna be a lot of demand. We all know how much real estate costs and how everything is just so expensive now. The fact that we're gonna be able to utilize properties that we have, land that's already paid for, and add another unit to an existing property, this is gonna be a really big deal. It's gonna help families who wanna help their kids, maybe a disabled family member, maybe, we meet with families where they really wanna bring in mom and dad instead of having them live in a separate house and having to manage an entire other house. We have a lot of families that come to us and then combining the household. So I think this is gonna be a really big deal. So again, when we meet with families, we look at what the arrangements are gonna be, what the goals are gonna be. We would typically also engage with the town, because there could be some different rules for different cities and towns. So we would definitely assist clients with contacting the town and looking at what the regulations are gonna be and what we need to keep in mind. So in the process, we would typically meet with a client, we would discuss what their needs are, we would look at what the regulations would be, and then we would actually define how much of a space they want to build. We would typically provide an initial proposal to give a client a rough idea of what the cost would be. And then we, for our company, not everyone does it this way, but we also have in-house design where we have an architectural designer on staff that would sit with our clients, design the ADU, whether it's gonna be an addition or the basement or a detached structure. And then we would meet with the client again once the plans are completed to provide finalized pricing. And then from there, we would usually go right into planning and permitting, and then of course, construction. I have included on everyone's table, I actually printed 2 different plans of recent units that we built. One is in Swansea, and that one happens to be 990 square feet, and that's because at the time Swansea was allowing up to 1,000 square foot accessory unit. Now they've adopted the state reg, so that's now 900 to be equal with the rest of the state. But I wanted to show you an example of, what 900 square feet looks like and what would fit in a plan roughly of that size. Generally speaking, it would definitely be only a 1-bedroom unit. But if there is a potential, if some of that space was integrated and shared with the existing house, there, in some cases, there may be an opportunity, where we would have bedrooms of varying sizes. And the second plan that I attached was just to show you, this is a basement plan where we did an accessory unit in the basement of a home in Rehoboth, and that was about 700 square feet. So I've attached these 2 plans. There's a lot of dimensions there, a lot of detail, which I think will be helpful to you, no matter who you approach to be the builder. That will give you sort of 2 primary design aspects that you can take into consideration. But these are the types of plans that we develop in-house with our own clients. The last point that I just wanted to mention in my aspect in terms of construction is there is a very big range in terms of construction costs, as you can imagine. So in some cases, someone may have a very big basement with existing space that we could utilize. They might have great ceiling height. So that would be a much more cost-effective situation because we have a structure already, we have outside walls, and we're just building and finishing a space within the house. So the range starts with that, and then obviously all the way to adding an addition where we're doing excavation on the lot, we're adding a full foundation, a whole nother structure, and then we're bringing in utilities into the new structure. And then the last piece that can obviously affect the range of cost is the septic system. Most of us, at least over the Mass line, the towns that we're discussing, a lot of these towns are mostly septics, and so we'd have to look at whether your septic already is big enough to service the new bedroom, or are we gonna expand the existing system? So as you can see, from a basement expansion that already exists to adding a whole nother structure to your house and then expanding the septic system, there is gonna be a big range in terms of cost. But those are the things that we would sit down and explore, and then you'd be in a good position to decide whether or not that's something that you would want to pursue. What I tell most clients is, when it comes to new construction, it's very hard to determine whether something makes sense until you get the numbers. So it's really important to sit down with a builder and try to get a very detailed proposal to get a good idea on cost before you spend any time with architectural plans and with permits and anything else. So that's usually the method that we use when we meet new families. So I will absolutely be available at the end of the presentation for any questions, but I hope that these plans will help everyone, to give everyone an idea of sort of the different models and design ideas that some families have already adopted. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Gary, that was terrific. I'm sure you'll be fielding a lot of questions afterwards, I would imagine. Next, we have Rico Conforti to speak about how you're gonna finance that beautiful addition you got
Good evening, everyone. If not, then we have home equity loans, home equity lines of credit, regular cash out refinance, or a construction loan. So if we're doing a home equity line of credit, basically the way that works is we appraise a house, goes up to 80% of your value minus your first mortgage. So let's say you have a house that's $500,000, you owe $300,000, you have $100,000 available in an equity. Downside to a home equity line of credit is it is a variable rate, so as the Fed changes their rates, it goes up and down, and that takes effect the following month of a rate change. Good thing is you only pay the interest on the money that you draw on. So unlike a home equity loan, which is a termed out loan, maximum term is 15 years, higher rate, and it's a termed out payment, so you're paying for money before you even use it, basically. Our next option is a cash out refinance. That works the same way. It's 80% of your value minus your first mortgage. Downside to that, if you're lucky enough to have one of those nice pandemic rates, 2, 3, 4%, you're going to lose that rate and go into today's rates. Now, if you don't have the value to get the money that you need, then we can do a construction loan or a rehab loan. So therefore, we take the plans, specs, cost estimates, have the property appraised as though the ADU is already there, so you're gaining that value. And then basically, in both instances, we would pay off the first mortgage, hold the funds back for construction, dole it out to you as you're doing it. On a rehab loan, if we're going that route, 6 months interest only, then you convert it to a principal and interest payment at the rate you closed at today. If we're going construction loan, 12 months interest only, and then you convert it to a principal and interest payment. So those are your basic options on getting it done. And I'll also be here for any questions that you might have.
Hi everyone, I'm Connie Wida with BayCoast Insurance. Oh wow, insurance usually isn't that fun, so thanks for the applause. I just wanted to share some factors to consider and potential questions your insurance agent is going to ask you once you get your plans and you start financing. First question probably is going to be who lives in the unit or who you plan to have living in the unit. Will your occupant pay rent? If it's another structure, other structure on your property, sometimes your agent or your carrier will allow to extend that from your homeowner's policy, but if it's a tenant, you're collecting rent, they may want that other structure written on a separate policy. Will the ADU have its own utilities? And also consider having a lease agreement with your renter if it will be a tenant. A lot of times if you have your tenant carry renter's insurance or tenant insurance, they can list you as an additional interest on their policy. So if they do put a claim in while living in your home, your property, you'll be able to see that. You'll be able to know in some sense, in some form. Is the unit going to be freestanding or attached to your home? Will your ADU be stick-built or modular unit? There's different ways to insure a modular unit, and some carriers don't like them, some love them. So it all depends on the niche of your carrier. And then does the ADU have a separate address or street number? That can also factor in on whether or not it can be extended from your home or be its own entity in itself. Next slide. There's no there? Oh, I got one. Perfect. Some carrier insight. Each scenario is unique. That makes each scenario is unique. So make sure you're transparent with your agent on what you're building. Give them the full picture. Sometimes folks will say, I'm buying this house and I'm doing this, but they're not going to tell you they have a lot of renovations to do. So please be transparent. It definitely comes down to if a claim will be paid out in the end. So make sure you're giving all the information up front. Insurance companies vary on how they handle ADUs, so communicate that with your agent and they can help facilitate that through the underwriter of the carrier in which writes your policy now. Some insurance companies will accept ADUs only upon completion of the building. So you may need a surplus policy to cover that construction process. Some carriers have different stances on if the ADU, like I said, is rented to non-family members or with the rent situation. So even if it's a non-family member who is paying rent, they may want a separate policy. If it's a family member who's paying rent, they might still give that grace and allow it to be covered under your homeowner's policy with some, endorsements and extra coverages added on. Agents need to ensure that the liability coverage is extended from the primary policy, and that may need to be purchased separate. That probably is the biggest takeaway, is regardless of what you do, if who you put in that unit, they may need extended liability to cover their things or their belongings. Your policy, may cover the structure in which you've decided to put a relative in, but their belongings may not be covered. So that's another piece to think about. But liability-wise, make sure you have enough coverage. You don't know who they may invite on the property, it's another tenant. So please be open-minded when your insurance agent is asking you questions. If you don't have a local agent, that's probably the most helpful resource I can advise you on is, it's great to get a cheap policy online really quick, but there's no one answering the phone when you have a question. So please keep that in mind, that we strongly encourage a local agent. And lucky you've met one today. So if you have any questions, I'll also be here. And I have my colleagues and my teammates over here as well if you have a lot of insurance questions.